Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some fascinating history, the history of the Philippines manufacturing class.
Ooh, interesting.
We're going to be exploring how it rose amidst, powerful landlords and foreign influence.
Yeah.
Our main guide for this deep dive is Landlords and Capitalists by Tamario C. Rivera.
It's a really fascinating book. It looks at not just the economic rise of this class, but how, being rooted in the old elite shaped their actions, shaped their conflicts, and ultimately impacted industrialization in the Philippines.
It's wild. We'll be focusing on the import substitution industrialization period, or ISI for short.
Right.
So think of ISI as the Philippines trying to boost their own manufacturing by limiting imports.
Yeah.
A pretty bold move away from the usual free trade.
Yeah, it was almost like a chance for them to forge their own economic path.
Exactly. A key question for us is, did they succeed in creating a truly independent national capitalist system?
Right.
Or were the forces against them just too strong? To get to the bottom of this, we need to go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries during American colonial rule.
Right. So picture the Philippines integrated into the world economy,
Okay.
but on someone else's terms.
On someone else's terms.
Exactly. This led to a wealthy Filipino class,
Mm-hmm.
but their wealth came mainly from exporting agricultural products,
Okay.
especially sugar.
Especially sugar.
By 1940, a staggering 75% of Philippine trade was with the U.S.
Wow, that's huge. So it's no wonder that most Filipinos with money just kind of stuck to what they knew, exporting those agricultural goods.
Right.
I mean, did anyone even try to break the mold back then?
Well, there were a few exceptions.
Okay.
Toribio Teodoro, who built a successful shoe factory,
Okay.
and Gonzalo Puyat, who is known for his furniture making.
Interesting.
They kind of defied the trend.
They did their own thing.
They did their own thing.
Yeah.
They showed that entrepreneurial spirit existed,
Yeah.
but the system really wasn't set up to support it.
The system wasn't there to support them?
Not really, no.
So, glimmers of possibility, but then even after independence in 1946,
Yeah.
the Bell Trade Act tied the Philippines to the U.S. economically. They even needed a constitutional amendment to secure American economic rights.
Yeah.
It seems like true economic independence felt so far off.
It did.
Yeah.
And that's where things get interesting. Post-World War II,
Okay.
the Philippines faced a double crisis,
Okay.
a communist peasant uprising
Oh, wow.
and a balance of payments crisis.
A double crisis.
Yeah, this gave the Philippine state a rare chance to assert itself.
A crisis forcing action. That's a pattern I feel like we see pretty often throughout history.
Yeah, definitely.
So what do?
In 1949, they introduced exchange controls.
Exchange control.
Yeah. Initially, this was meant to stabilize the peso,
Mm-hmm.
but they ended up using it to promote domestic manufacturing by restricting imports.
Okay.
And surprisingly, even the U.S. backed this, at least for a while.
Hold on. The U.S. supporting protectionist policies.
Right.
That's not really what they're usually known for.
There's no-
What was their angle?
Well, remember, this is the Cold War context.
Okay.
The U.S. wanted to contain communism,
Right.
and a stable, somewhat industrialized Philippines served that goal.
Ah, okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So this exchange control policy led to a boom in Filipino manufacturing in the 1950s.
It did.
And seemingly, they were fulfilling that dream of national capitalist development.
Right.
But I'm guessing it wasn't that simple.
Not quite. This is where the divisions within the manufacturing class itself become really crucial.
Okay.
Rivera identifies three distinct segments:
Okay.
landed capitalists, non-landed capitalists, and Chinese Filipino capitalists.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Tell me more about these segments.
All right, the landed capitalists were the dominant group.
Okay.
They were descended from the old landowning elite.
Mm-hmm.
They diversified into manufacturing,
Okay.
but they held on to their land.
They held on to their land.
Think of families like the Ayalas and the Sorianos.
So they were at the top of the manufacturing game.
Yeah.
But also the same folks who benefited from free trade and opposed land reform.
Right.
That sounds like a recipe for some serious internal conflict.
It was. What about the other two segments?
Yeah, what about those other two segments?
So the non-landed capitalists were newer.
Okay.
They were more reliant on state support,
Okay.
like licenses and loans.
Licenses and loans?
Some were even involved in exporting natural resources,
Okay.
like the Tantocos in logging and paper,
Interesting.
or the Lirags who built a textile empire.
Okay.
And then you have the Chinese-Filipino capitalists.
Okay.
They have a long history of trading in the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
but they had limited land ownership.
Limited land
They had
ownership.
strong family-based businesses.
Okay.
They faced discrimination.
Oh, wow.
But they gained strength after 1975 when naturalization laws were relaxed.
Okay, so each segment with its own unique story and relationship with the state and the economy.
Yeah.
But if the landed capitalists were top dog, couldn't they just push for policies that benefited them in both their roles as landowner and manufacturer?
Well, that's the core issue.
Yeah.
Here's where their inherent conflict of interest gets really interesting.
Okay.
As landlords exporting agricultural goods,
Mm-hmm.
they wanted minimal trade restrictions
Makes sense.
to sell internationally at the best prices.
Yeah.
But as manufacturers,
Yeah.
they needed protection from foreign competition to let their factories flourish.
Wait, so they wanted both free trade and protectionism.
They did.
How does that even work? Those seem totally opposite.
Imagine trying to ride two horses going in opposite directions. You're bound to fall off.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
This inability to commit fully to one direction,
Right.
coupled with a state heavily influenced by elite interests,
Yeah.
meant that the Philippines never really moved past the easy phase of ISI, producing more complex goods.
Okay.
They missed the chance to create a bigger domestic market through land reform, which the landed class blocked.
So a missed opportunity for deeper economic development.
Yeah.
Stifled by the very class that was supposed to be leading it.
Exactly. And to add another layer of complexity, we can't forget about the role of foreign capital.
Right. Even when they're trying to build a more independent economy, that shadow of foreign influence is still there.
It is.
How do they manage that?
Well, they set up subsidiaries.
Okay.
They went into joint ventures.
Mm-hmm.
And they made licensing agreements with local firms.
Interesting.
Data from the central bank shows that most foreign direct investments went into chemicals, food, and basic metals between 1970 and 1985.
So they found their way in.
They did.
But was this foreign involvement ultimately helpful or harmful to Filipino manufacturing's growth?
That's where the nuance is key.
Okay.
On one hand, it brought in capital and technology.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it also limited the export potential of Filipino firms,
Oh, wow.
reinforcing dependency.
Okay.
A 1972 UNC TAD study actually revealed restrictive clauses in licensing agreements that prevented Filipino companies from exporting their products,
Wow.
keeping them reliant on the domestic market.
So a boost, but with strings attached.
Exactly. And then came Marcos.
Ah, yes. The Marcos era from 1965 to 1986. That's another huge turning point.
It is. Through martial law, he consolidated power and intervened heavily in the economy.
Okay.
He used state resources like control over export crops and access to foreign loans to build patronage networks,
Okay.
creating a new class of what we call crony capitalists.
Crony capitalism, a term we hear a lot.
Would it?
But it's always good to unpack what it really means.
Yeah.
Who were some of these cronies, and how did they impact manufacturing?
It's fascinating how cronyism was built upon the existing power structure.
Okay.
For example, Eduardo Cojuangco Jr., a prominent landed capitalist, gained control of the coconut industry.
Okay.
And Lucio Tan, a Chinese-Filipino businessman, rose to dominate tobacco.
Interesting.
This crony capitalism strengthened the existing oligopoly, further blocking the development of a dynamic and independent industrial sector.
So it was like the system was rigged from the start.
Yeah.
Concentrating power in the hands of a few.
Wait, that's what...
Regardless of which segment they came from.
Yeah.
This raises a big question for me. Could the Philippines have taken a different path? We've seen countries like South Korea and Taiwan achieve remarkable industrial growth.
Right.
Though under authoritarian regimes,
Right.
could the Philippines, with its unique history and social structure, have done the same?
That's a complex question,
Yeah.
and one that we'll continue exploring as we dive deeper into this fascinating period of Philippine history.
Definitely lots to unpack here.
It really makes you think, were there any alternative paths for the Philippines?
Yeah, could they have achieved that level of industrial success we saw in other countries? Like, how did they miss out on that?
Well, it's a question historians and economists still debate today.
I bet.
Even with a more decisive state, they would need fundamental reforms,
Okay.
starting with land reform.
Redistributing
land could have empowered a larger population, creating a stronger domestic market for manufactured goods.
It's like that classic chicken or egg dilemma. Do you need a strong domestic market to drive industrialization, or does industrialization create that market?
It's a bit of both, really. They feed into each other.
Yeah.
But in the Philippines, without land reform, most people remain tied to agriculture with limited buying power.
Right.
And this hampered the growth of the domestic market, which in turn discouraged further industrial development.
It's like this frustrating cycle.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the landed capitalists were perfectly positioned to benefit from this system.
Right.
They could profit from agriculture while dabbling in manufacturing, never fully committing to one or the other.
Exactly. Which makes the non-landed and Chinese Filipino capitalists even more interesting.
Okay, yeah, how so?
They didn't have that land ownership safety net, so they were more dependent on state support.
Right.
And vulnerable to shifts in economic policy.
Right. They were the real risk takers then.
There were.
Forced to be more adaptable and innovative to survive.
Yeah.
Do you think their trajectory could have been different if the state had been a more reliable partner?
Absolutely. This is where the concept of embedded autonomy comes in.
Embedded autonomy.
It's the idea that a state needs to be both independent from, yet deeply engaged with, the dominant forces in society.
That sounds like a really tricky balancing act.
It is.
How can a state be both independent and engaged?
Think of South Korea. Their state actively supported their cabals,
Okay.
those large family-controlled conglomerates.
Right.
That played a key role in their industrialization.
Okay.
They provided loans, tax breaks, even directed them towards specific industries.
Wow.
But there was accountability. If the cables didn't perform, didn't meet expectations for growth and innovation, they faced consequences.
So it was a two-way street, support in exchange for results.
Exactly. It was a symbiotic relationship, though within an authoritarian context. But it shows that a strong state can guide industrialization, even starting with traditional family-based structures.
That's a stark contrast to the Philippines,
It is.
where the state seemed more reactive than proactive, often captured by elite interests instead of leading them toward a national goal.
Yeah.
Talk about missed opportunities.
Right. It highlights those missed chances.
Right.
What if the Philippine state had been more assertive, had taken on that strategic guiding role?
Yeah,
Could they have achieved similar success? It's a question worth pondering.
definitely. And one we'll keep in mind as we continue.
Right.
We've talked about the landed and non-landed capitalists, but what about that third segment?
Yeah.
The Chinese Filipino capitalists. What was their experience like during ISI?
They're a fascinating case study in resilience and adaptation.
Okay.
They faced unique challenges, discrimination, and limited access to land ownership.
Right.
But they also had remarkable entrepreneurial skills, a strong sense of community, and access to international networks, especially in Taiwan and Hong Kong.
So even without land or deep political connections, they carved out a significant space in manufacturing.
You did.
What were some of their key strategies for success?
They leveraged their strong kinship networks for capital and information.
Okay.
They were known for efficient management practices, focusing on high turnover and low margins.
Okay.
And most importantly, they were incredibly adaptable.
Adaptable.
When facing challenges, they pivoted to find new opportunities.
Can you give me an example of that adaptability in action? Like, how did they respond to specific policies or economic shifts?
A great example is their response to the Retail Trade Nationalization Act of 1954.
Okay.
This act restricted retail trade to Filipino citizens,
Okay.
putting many Chinese businesses at a disadvantage.
Right.
So instead of fighting it, many shifted their focus from retailing to manufacturing and wholesale trading.
They saw the writing on the wall and changed their approach.
They did.
They weren't tied to a specific sector or way of doing things,
Right.
willing to change with the times.
Exactly. That flexibility let them thrive, even in a system that wasn't always in their favor.
Interesting.
They mastered niche markets, finding opportunities in textiles, food processing, even steel production.
Wow.
And after 1975, when naturalization became easier, they expanded even further.
It sounds like they represent a different kind of national capitalist development.
It does.
One that's not about land ownership or political patronage, but built on entrepreneurial skills, community networks, and adaptability. Could this be a model for other developing nations?
It's a thought-provoking idea, and it raises a question that Rivera doesn't fully explore in his book.
Oh, interesting.
Could the rise of Chinese Filipino capital, with its global connections and entrepreneurial spirit, offer a new model for Philippine industrialization?
Okay.
One less reliant on old elite structures and more in tune with a globalized economy?
That's a really fascinating question. It suggests that there might be alternative paths to development beyond that traditional model of a strong state guiding a select group of national champions. Maybe a more decentralized, more entrepreneurial approach, like what we see with the Chinese Filipino capitalists, could lead to more inclusive and dynamic industrial growth.
It's certainly worth considering. But before we go too far down that road, let's circle back to the Marcos era
Okay.
and the impact of crony capitalism on manufacturing as a whole.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though each segment of the capitalist class had its own unique experience, they all had to navigate the realities of a system increasingly dominated by Marcos and his cronies.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that had a profound impact on the trajectory of Philippine manufacturing.
You're absolutely right. The rise of crony capitalism under Marcos was a turning point.
Okay.
It worsened existing inequalities and distorted the development of a truly competitive market.
Okay.
Marcos used state resources to reward loyalty and punish rivals,
Right.
creating an environment where success was often determined not by skill, but by political connections.
So it was a complete perversion of that embedded autonomy concept. Instead of the state guiding the market, it became a tool for personal enrichment and political control.
Precisely. And that had a devastating effect on the manufacturing sector.
Okay.
Crony-controlled companies got preferential treatment, access to cheap credit, and protection from competition.
Wow.
This created an uneven playing field, stifling innovation and discouraging genuine entrepreneurial activity.
So it wasn't about having the best business plan or the most efficient production methods.
Right.
It was about who was closest to Marcos and who could benefit from his system of patronage. How did people even survive in this system?
It was a challenging environment for those who weren't part of Marcos's inner circle. Many legitimate businesses struggled to compete while corruption flourished.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was.
Was there any pushback against this crony capitalism?
There was definitely growing resentment among those excluded from the spoils.
Yeah.
People could see the damage it was doing to the economy and the country as a whole.
Or?
But under martial law, speaking out against Marcos and his cronies was dangerous.
So they were trapped in a system that was rigged against them. What happened when that system started to crumble? Did things start to change?
Well, the cracks in the system were already showing before Marcos was ousted in 1986.
Okay.
The economy was stagnating, foreign debt was piling up, and public discontent was on the rise. The people power revolution, which ultimately led to Marcos's downfall, was a combination of all these factors.
It's fascinating how those economic and political forces intertwine to create this pivotal moment in Philippine history.
Yeah.
So Marcos is gone. What happens next?
Right.
Does crony capitalism just disappear with him?
Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple.
I figured.
While Marcos's departure marked the end of his direct control over the economy, the legacy of crony capitalism was much harder to shake off.
Okay.
Many of the same families and networks that benefited under Marcos continued to wield considerable influence, even as the Philippines transitioned to a more democratic system.
So even with the change in leadership, those old power structures persisted. How did this impact the manufacturing sector in the post-Marcos era? Did those who had been sidelined during the crony capitalism years finally get a chance to thrive?
There was definitely a sense of optimism and a push for reform in the immediate aftermath of the people power revolution.
Okay.
But dismantling the deeply entrenched system of patronage and favoritism proved to be a long and arduous process.
Oh, I bet.
Some progress was made, but the influence of the old elite and the lure of quick profits through connections rather than innovation continued to hamper the development of a truly competitive and dynamic manufacturing sector.
So it's a story of continuity as much as it is a story of change.
Yeah.
The shadow of crony capitalism continued to loom large even as the Philippines tried to move forward. What were some of the long-term consequences of this for the country's economic development?
Well, it contributed to a culture of corruption
Okay.
and a deep distrust of government institutions. It also hindered the emergence of a strong middle class, as opportunities for advancement were often limited to those with the right connections.
Okay.
And it discouraged foreign investment, as businesses were wary of the lack of transparency and the risk of being squeezed out by politically connected rivals.
So the legacy of crony capitalism cast a long shadow,
It did.
impacting everything from economic growth to social mobility to international relations. What a sobering thought.
It certainly is. And it highlights the importance of strong institutions and a level playing field for fostering genuine economic development. When power is concentrated in the hands of a few, and when success is determined by who you know rather than what you know, it distorts the market.
Yeah.
and undermines the potential for broad-based prosperity.
It's a good reminder that even when we talk about economic systems and industrial development, we can't ignore the human element, the impact of power dynamics, and individual choices on the broader trajectory of a nation.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Rivera's book so insightful. He doesn't just give us an economic analysis of the ISI period.
Right.
He also delves into the personal stories, the family histories, the intricate web of relationships that shaped this period of Philippine history.
It's like we're getting a glimpse behind the curtain, seeing the human faces behind the economic data.
Yeah,
And that makes it all the more compelling, doesn't it?
it does. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of abstract forces, but a story of individuals, families, and communities striving to make their way in a complex and ever-changing world.
And sometimes those individual stories can reveal as much about a country's economic development as any chart or graph. It's all interconnected.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And in the case of the Philippines, those stories are full of intriguing contradictions, missed opportunities, and a persistent yearning for a more equitable and prosperous future.
Yeah, it's a story that feels both familiar and unique.
Right.
Familiar because we see these patterns of power and influence play out in so many different contexts.
Mm.
But unique because of the Philippines' specific history, its colonial legacy,
Yeah.
and that complex interplay between different segments of its capitalist class.
Exactly. And that complexity is what makes studying the Philippines so fascinating. It challenges us to look beyond simple explanations
Right.
and really grapple with the nuances of historical change.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What do you hope they'll remember about this history of Philippine manufacturing and the ISI bourgeoisie?
I hope they come away with an appreciation for the fact that the path to industrialization is rarely a straight line.
Yeah.
It's a process that's filled with obstacles, internal struggles, and external pressures. And as the Philippines experience shows, even with good intentions, success isn't guaranteed.
It's a really good reminder that economic development is more than just policies and numbers. It's about people, their decisions, their relationships with each other.
Absolutely.
In the institutions that shape their lives.
Precisely. And understanding those human dynamics is essential if we want to create a more just and prosperous future. Not just for the Philippines, but for all developing nations.
Well said. It seems like we keep circling back to this idea of missed opportunities.
Yeah.
If things had been different, if the state had been stronger, if land reform had been implemented,
Right.
if crony capitalism hadn't taken root, could the Philippines have achieved a different outcome?
It's impossible to say for sure, of course,
Yeah,
but it's a question that's worth asking.
definitely.
It encourages us to think critically about the factors that shape economic development and to consider alternative paths that might have been taken.
And maybe it also encourages us to look at the present with a more critical eye,
Yeah.
to ask ourselves what lessons we can learn from the past
Right.
and how we can apply those lessons to create a more equitable and sustainable future.
Absolutely. History isn't just about looking backward, it's also about looking forward, using the past to inform our present and to guide our actions in the future.
So as we conclude our exploration of Philippine manufacturing and the ISI bourgeoisie, I want to leave our listeners with one final provocative thought. We've talked about the challenges, the missed opportunities,
Right.
but what about the potential? We touched upon the remarkable resilience and adaptability of the Chinese-Filipino capitalists.
We did.
Could their rise, with their global connections and their entrepreneurial drive, offer a new path for Philippine industrialization? One that's less reliant on those old elite structures and more aligned with the dynamics of a globalized economy?
A compelling question,
Yeah.
and one that deserves further exploration.
Yeah.
It suggests that there might be alternative models for development,
Right.
models that move beyond the traditional reliance on a strong state guiding a select few.
Right.
Perhaps a more decentralized, more entrepreneurial approach could hold the key to a more inclusive and dynamic form of industrial growth for the Philippines.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. Plenty of food for thought and a new avenue to explore. We encourage you to continue learning, to keep asking those tough questions, and to never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.